Hey all, so we're going to be talking about decolonizing psychology in this segment of the video. And one of the first things that's important to understand when talking about decolonizing psychology is what it means to say that psychology is colonial. This statement, that our current understanding of psychology is in fact colonial, departs from the idea that the bulk of work in mainstream psychological science still reflects the interests of a privileged minority of people in affluent centers of the modern global order. Further, compared to other social science disciplines, there are few critical voices who reflect on the Euro-American colonial character of psychological science. That is, its relationship to the ongoing process of domination that facilitates growth and success for a privileged minority, but that undermines sustainability for the global majority. And who exactly are the individuals that reap benefits from the colonization of mainstream intellectual production? According to the work of Heinrich Heine and Norton Zion, there are folks that live in Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic settings, also known by the acronym WEIRD. Next slide, please. When talking about the notions of coloniality in psychological science, there are two main ways in which this materializes. The first is metacolonialism, otherwise known as the coloniality of being. This is an idea put forth by Hussein Bulhan. In a 2015 publication, he emphasized that colonial violence is not limited to the occupation of land and control over material resources, but also extends to occupation of being, or control over psychological resources, otherwise known as mental colonialization. The end result of a colonial occupation of being is what refers to as metacolonialism, and this is the sense that Euro-American understandings are hegemonic and defining modern global realities. In regard to the coloniality of knowledge, this idea goes by the name of Orientalism, and this was put forth by Lander in 2000. Whereas the coloniality of being refers to ways in which everyday habits of mind reflect the process of colonization, the coloniality of knowledge extends this analysis from everyday habits of mind to authoritative practices and understandings. Lander writes that hegemonic psychological science and other authoritative bodies of knowledge observe the neoliberal individualist ways of being associated with the modern global order, interpret these ways of being as essential components of human nature abstracted from historical context, and then elevate these ways of being to the status of normative standard for all of humanity. This elevation of a dominant particular as a universal standard is a form of epistemic violence that masks the problematic history of the standard and does so without regard for a local context. Slide, please. That being said, how do we go about decolonizing psychology? Drawing from the article by Adams and Molina, they propose three different methods for accomplishing this feat. The first of which is decolonization as indigenization. This approach relies on the work that locally grounded researchers and practitioners do to reclaim local or indigenous wisdom to produce forms of knowledge that resonate with local realities and better serve local communities. The tendency in mainstream psychological science is to treat indigenous conceptions of health and well-being as a form of ethnopsychology. That is, mere folk belief based on local cosmology rather than scientific truth based on empirical evidence. In response to this portrayal, indigenization approaches to decolonization perform a version of the cultural psychology strategy of normalization, treating as legitimate the indigenous forms of knowledge and practice that mainstream science devalues or treats as illegitimate. Despite these important strengths, indigenization approaches to decolonization are limited by the emphasis placed on local understandings. Because the goal of indigenization approaches is often to serve particular marginalized communities, the resulting local knowledge does not necessarily generalize to other marginalized communities or speak back to hegemonic psychological science as a whole. This moves us to option 2. Slide, please. And this option is coined decolonization as accompaniment. In this approach, global expert researchers from mainstream academic settings travel to colonized, racialized, or otherwise marginal communities to lend expertise and work side local inhabitants in struggles for social justice. The idea here is that academically trained scholars and researchers should leave the comfort of the ivory tower to participate more directly in efforts at social change. This approach seeks to decolonize psychological science not so much in its content as in the uses to which it is put in the communities that it serves. Potential weaknesses or problems from this strategy arise from the fact that psychologists engaging with this process are positioned as outside experts who periodically visit marginalized communities before returning to the relative privilege and comfort of mainstream university centers. A psychologist's position of relative power and privilege can enable colonial practices, whereby researchers and practitioners appropriate or distort marginalized voices for their own professional agenda. quite the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish here. And our last option is decolonization as denaturalization. Slide, please. While the focus of the last two approaches was to use psychological science to dismantle oppressive forces as they act in situations of colonization, in contrast, the denaturalization approach to decolonization proceeds from the understanding that researchers must turn the analytic lens from exclusive consideration of oppression in colonized societies to rethink the ways of being that masquerade as natural standards in Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic settings, as well as in hegemonic psychological science. The primary goal of the denaturalization approach to decolonizing is to disrupt forms of epistemic violence and to illuminate alternative ways of being, such as a critical consciousness of racism instead of colorblind ignorance, or the sustainable relationality versus the pursuit of growth. However, the same focus on epistemic violence that is a primary strength of denaturalization approaches is also its primary weakness. For psychologists accompanying people in marginalized communities and struggles against material violence, the focus on epistemic violence via mainstream research from the insulated security of ivory tower institutions may be precisely the sort of sanitized business as usual approach to hegemonic psychological science that requires decolonization. Regardless of the method chosen, engagement with these epistemological perspectives provides training and habits of perception that enable scientists and practitioners to notice, document, and counteract everyday forms of coloniality and epistemic violence that are typically hidden in plain sight. And now we move on to activities.